All right, very good. Well, I'm seeing that the participant levels kind of level off here, so we'll go ahead and jump in. So again, welcome to today's webinar. So glad to have you join us. Thank you for taking the time out of your busy schedules to join us for the discussion. As we've been jumping online here the last few times to have conversations around the 30 by 30 efforts in California, it's just been remarkable how many people are coming together to share your stories, to build connections, to build knowledge, to build relationships, and to increase the pace and scale of activity across the state. Want to just provide a couple of objectives for today. As I mentioned at the beginning, this is the first time that we're moving away from a broad suite of approaches across the 10 different pathways to 30 by 30 and really providing a focus on pathway 3, which is to increase voluntary conservation easements. And delighted to have a lot of great success stories to share, insights and lessons learned along the way, new tools and resources to share with you as we think about pathway 3 and how it intersects with and supports the other pathways that we're pursuing towards 30 by 30. For today, we're going to start with a few updates. So we've got Jennifer Norris, Deputy Secretary for Biodiversity and Habitat, who's going to jump on here in a second and share some updates, both on the annual progress report that was just shared and some of the successes that are highlighted in that report, as well as to provide a little bit more background and grounding in Pathway 3, how it was developed, why it's important, what we're learning, and building a little bit of a foundation for the conversation that we'll have with our group of panelists. From that, really excited to jump into a partner progress report. So we've got 3 distinguished colleagues who are advancing progress in different landscapes and different ways using complementary approaches. So you'll have an introduction to the work of Kay Ogden, Lori Wayburn, and Aaron Praler. And then following that, really excited to introduce the work of Green Info Network and Amanda Kohanek with the Green Info Network, who provide tools, resources, and insights that really help support the work for all of us. So really excited to have that. I just want to also highlight that this is a little bit of a webinar format, so it's going to be much of a listening session for most people, but we really do understand and appreciate that this is a shared effort and want to engage you as often as we can throughout. So feel free to jump into the chat. I see that you're using the chat already to provide comments, and Emily, really appreciate the comment that you just provided there around tribal outreach. Also, the Q&A function is going to be active throughout. So as you're thinking about things that you would like to contribute in terms of comments, feedback, resources, updates from your own work, please use the chat function. As you encounter a question along the way, please use that Q&A function for that. And we'll try to keep those separate so that the questions really are focused on the different presentations and speakers that are in front of us today. With that, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Deputy Secretary Jen Norris for a few quick updates and highlights on what's going on around the state. As she does that, would invite all of you to share updates from your work in the chat.
Thanks, Sean, and thanks everyone for participating. It's been a while since we've had a statewide webinar. Time goes so fast these days, but I'm always delighted when we get together and talk about how we can advance 30 by 30 together. It just makes me feel excited and hopeful that there are so many of you out there doing great things. So today we are going to talk about conservation easements, but first let me give you just a quick update of what we've been up to. Hopefully all of you saw that we delivered our annual progress report just a few weeks ago. Pathways to 30 by 30 annual progress report. The big news of that report is that we added 631,000 acres to our total. I would like to see 1 million a year, but I will take nearly 3/4 of it because this is amazing progress and it really shows what we can do when we pull together. Many of you know that some historic funding was delivered through last year's budget. Those funds are just rolling out. So I really expect next year's numbers to be even better, but I'm really excited about our progress here. And some of what that progress represents, we're actually going to talk about today, which is that we've got some improved mapping where we were able to identify some areas that were already protected but weren't in our total, as well as additional lands that were added. So we're up to 24.4%. We're on the march. We have about 5.5 million acres to go, and I have every confidence that we're going to get there. The thing I love about this progress report is it really highlights progress from all of you. And so in the next slide, I've just got some photos from the report. Each of our pathways and each of our core commitments and key objectives, we highlight a story from around the state that exemplifies that element. So there are just wonderful stories throughout the document, individual projects implemented by all of you, that really demonstrates the breadth and enthusiasm and the variety of ways that we can work together to accomplish 30 by 30. So if you haven't seen that, I hope you will check it out. It's on our website at California Nature. And it's really just an inspiration, and it also shows you again, like all the ways that we can work together. So today's webinar is about conservation easements, and conservation easements are such an important part of our landscape in California. They're crucial to protecting our biodiversity. We have a lot of private land. Half the land in California is in private ownership, generating economic activity, and we want to see that continue. And so many of the actions that are taken on that private land are really beneficial to our biological diversity. They sequester carbon, they protect our communities from the effects of climate change. So conservation easements are a key element. In terms of total acres, there may be just a portion, but they're so essential for demonstrating how private landowners can participate and keep land in private ownership. So a conservation easement, it's a voluntary legal agreement that permanently limits uses of the land in order to protect its conservation values. And it can maintain those lands for open space, wildlife, ecological function, as well as resource production and scenic benefits. But conservation easements come in lots of forms. And so that's what we want to talk about today is sort of what those look like and which ones meet our 30 by 30. I think our next slide shows you how many acres. Yes. So over the last year, we added 529,500 acres of conservation easements, which is amazing. And I think demonstrates the value, again, of elevating this work, but also gets to sort of the challenge we have, which is that we're not voluntary. Conservation easements come in a lot of flavors, and we've been working through which of those really contribute to our 30 by 30 goal. And we'll talk more about that later in the webinar. 1.3 million acres in total right now are contributing to our total towards 30%. So that's a lot, and it's meaningful, and again, really valuable to our efforts. So next slide. So pathway 3, we recognize, as I've said, that we can't just buy up in fee for public ownership all the conservation land in the state, nor do we want to. There's many places throughout the state that are generating economic activity, that are helping people put food on the table, but also protecting our biodiversity. So we have conservation easements that include wetlands, agricultural lands, grasslands, and forests. And which of those meet our definition of 30 by 30 protected areas, I think, has been the big challenge and what we want to unpack today. And so we're going to share with you some examples of different kinds of conservation easements that do meet our definition, but also talk about the fact that there are other easements. I'm thinking of agricultural easements in particular, with row crops maybe, that protect open space, that might provide biodiversity on the margins, but are in more active use. But those are recognized as part of our complementary conservation measures, pathway 9. So there are easements that meet our definition. There are easements that maybe don't, but are part of our broader, help us meet our broader objectives. And we want to try to unpack some of that today. So to help us in this conversation, I've got 3 amazing people who really demonstrate sort of the breadth of conservation easements that you see across California, and we're gonna dig in on those. And I think I'm just going to jump right in and tell you about, so I've got Kay Ogden, Lori Wayburn, and Erin Praler. And we'll start with Kay, who's going to tell us a little story about what she's working on. So Kay Ogden, first of all, she's on our partnership coordinating committee, which I really appreciate. She's been a really helpful participant in making sure that land trusts across California are part of our conversation. So she's championed land trust work in the Eastern Sierra for a decade, resulting in the preservation of over 21,000 acres. Way to go, Kay. But her commitment extends statewide. She holds the position of vice chair for the California Council of Land Trusts. And as I said, she's on our partnership coordinating committee. Beyond these efforts, Kay embraces a more personal connection to nature. She spends a lot of her free time walking her rescue German Shepherd in the high desert and crafting homegrown and homemade canned goods for friends. And she's known for her delightful chutney. And I will tell you, this is true. She gave me some unbelievable bourbon jam last fall, and it's truly, I'm sad that I'm out and I need more. So Kay, with that, I'll turn it over to you to tell us what you've been working on.
Thank you, Jen. I really appreciate that. And I'll get to canning here shortly. Just got a few things on my plate. ESLT is celebrating our 22nd anniversary this year. We're nationally accredited land trust, and we work in a region that is comprised of nearly 90% of private lands and host over 4 million visitors a year. I first saw the Eastern Sierra when I rode my bike from LA to Mono Lake, carrying a small, fragile vial of water through the hot desert, over the hills and mountains to be poured back into Mono Lake. I often say that the Eastern Sierra reached in, grabbed my heart and soul, and hasn't let go. I'm exceptionally privileged to be able to work at a job that allows me every day to protect a place that makes my heart beat. At ESLT, our primary tool for permanent and voluntary private land conservation has been the conservation easement, which protects the identified conservation values of the property while allowing appropriate uses and limiting development. A main focus of ESLT for the past decade has been working rangelands. As an example, the Honeywell Ranch in Bridgeport Valley in Mono County is a good example of how protecting well-managed working lands has many co-benefits: wildlife habitat, connectivity, supporting biodiversity, tourism, recreation, scenic view sheds, and economics. The Honeywell Ranch has been in the family since 1861 and is a working cattle ranch and a very well-known popular guest ranch where folks come and help do cattle ranch operations. We've heard that there are grandchildren now coming of folks who came years ago. The family had a great interest in protecting their ranch and the conservation values. We tried 13 years ago and it didn't work out. Those of you who are in this business understand appraisal issues can get in the way sometimes. That's what happened then. The family came back in 2018 and a partnership was formed with Wildlife Conservation Board, NRCS, and of course ESLT and the landowner. The 4,100 acre conservation easement protects in perpetuity the ag lands, the grazing use, grasslands of special significance and open space characteristics, wildlife habitat, water quality, and historic recreational use of the property that the landowner allows. The property is adjacent to public lands managed by U.S. Forest Service and connects additional lands under conservation easements held by ESLT, California Rangeland Trust, and the Natural Resource Conservation Service. The patchwork of over 17,000 acres conserved and or protected in Bridgeport Valley is a large-scale conservation benefit that increases species biodiversity, habitat, and connectivity. Next slide, please. The Honeywell Conservation Easement includes more than a mile of the East Walker River, portions of Robinson Creek, Green Creek, and Buckeye Creek. The landowner allows public access for hiking and fishing on portions of their property that connect to nearby lands and backcountry trails into Yosemite. Landowners irrigate pastures, rangeland, and forest land in accordance with the management plan that maintains good forage base, diverse plant species, and good wildlife habitat. Grazing is timed in accordance with wildlife habitat needs and aims to protect soil health, water quality, and quantity. Next slide, please. One of the co-benefits of the conservation easement includes protection of multiple species, including the crazy bi-state sage grouse, which is on the right here. We also have mule deer, pronghorn, which is on the left, badger, black bear, amphibians, songbirds, raptors, waterfowl, and numerous common and rare plant species. This is a high-profile property due to its location and size, and the landowners are deeply engaged in the community. Successfully implementing this project most likely generated interest from other landowners in the area. Since the completion of this easement, we completed 2 additional conservation easements totaling 3,000 acres, similar habitat and values. This easement protects tribal heritage by limiting further development on ancestral lands. Next slide, please. While the conservation easement is a common tool, there's multiple ways to protect private land with willing landowners. And many land trusts are embracing new partnerships and learning how to be more creative. A collaborative project that I'm working on received funding just last week from the Sierra Nevada Conservancy to support the purchase of a 160-acre parcel and return ancestral lands to our partners, the Mono Lake Kutsetica tribe, who will hold the fee title. This is a land back project. The tribe plans to use the cabins and facilities as a seasonal operations base to house their tribally led conservation crew, which is a youth empowerment and career development program, and maintain habitat for common and sensitive species. Next slide, please. This is Charlotte Lang, who is the Mono Lake Kutsetica tribe chairwoman. I'd like you to read her quote because it's the purpose behind this important voluntary land conservation project. The tribe is looking to bring back Tubi Nobi to tribal ownership and manage the buildings and landscape for multiple uses that will help the tribe preserve cultural heritage and utilize traditional knowledge to steward the parcel to support nature-based solutions for climate change impacts for the tribe and adjacent communities. And this, of course, fits the core commitments and many of the pathways that are outlined in our initiative. So I know I'm a bit over time, so I'm going to stop.
Thank you, Kay. Oh man, what a great story. That land back is really exciting, and more please. So thank you so much. I'm going to turn it over to Lori Wayburn. Lori, I'm thrilled to have you here. I probably get more questions about forests and how they fit into 30 by 30 than anything. And of course, forests are struggling right now. I mean, we're looking at the fires in Canada, and we experienced the same thing here. So well-managed forests are so important, and your work, I know, is critical to that. So as an introduction to the rest of you, Lori Wayburn is co-founder and president of the Pacific Forest Trust. She's an accomplished forest and conservation innovator. She advises policymakers at the state, regional, national, and international level, and pioneers new approaches to develop sustainable resource economies using her deep experience in the fields of conservation, ecosystem services, and sustainability. Thank you so much for joining us today, Lori. Take it away.
Well, thank you so much, Jen. And I wish I made that kind of a set of preserves, but maybe Kay will give us all lessons, and then we can really blend preservation and conservation.
There you go.
Well, thank you so much. Really appreciate the chance to be part of this. And the Pacific Forest Trust is celebrating its 30th year. We are a thrice accredited land trust. Our goal, our mission is to partner with private landowners to conserve and steward their well-managed lands in order to reweave that larger forest landscape that we all depend upon. We've conserved about 350,000 acres. We hold easements on about 110,000 acres of forest land. And we work in California, Oregon, and to some degree in Washington State. I wanted to talk today about how our active approach to conserving managed forest lands is so critical to both restoring and then conserving habitat for our amazing biodiversity here in California. So this is an example of that biodiversity. You have a cedar and an oak with a fissure in between them with that. So next slide, please. I'm going to focus my conversation on a particular area that we concentrate our activities in. That's the roughly 7 million acres that are the headwaters for the Sacramento River. And there's a very close link between water, biodiversity, and climate change and forests. So this region actually supports 80% of California's habitat types and already provides habitat for over 60% of our vertebrates. And you'll see there that there's a bit of a link already with the fact that these 7 million acres also provide the core of the state's utilized water and is critical for San Francisco Bay and its habitats and species that rely upon that. And as Jen just mentioned, there's a very strong linkage between forests, climate change, and carbon. This region is also the most expandable carbon sink for the state in the near term. Next slide, please. The habitat context for this is that it's an extraordinarily diverse region. This is actually the most biodiverse conifer forest in the world. So it's globally recognized for that biodiversity. And that is derived from the fact that it has such an amazing suite of geologic and topographic features, from very little above sea level to 14,000 plus feet above sea level, with volcanics, metamorphic, sedimentaries. And so you have these high alpine lakes like Little Picayune Lake, and I included Picayune Lake because I just love to say the word Picayune. And then over to, in the McCloud River Basin, a rare pure stand of black oak. Obviously, these support a very different suite of biodiversity. And of course, there's everything in between. Next slide, please. So this is a key challenge that we face in this region. Public lands are roughly 62% of this landscape, and private lands are about 48%. As you see from the old USGS type map there, we've got a checkerboard, which means that, every 640 acres, and sometimes in small blocks within that, you can have a different management approach, and that can be extremely stressful for habitat function. On the right, you see what that can translate to on the landscape with, on private lands, pretty intensive management with a lot of disturbance, which can also be very disturbing for habitat function. And then the public lands, much less management, which also has its issues because much less management can translate to significantly overcrowded forests where fire has been suppressed historically. And we're now driving a lot of attention to reducing those fuel loads, because this habitat overall, this suite of habitats within this region, historically are shaped by fire, both indigenously driven fire and naturally occurring fire. So it's a fire adapted region from which we have excluded fire, and we're now having to work to reintroduce that in a safer way. But critical for wildlife is that those little squares on a map mean absolutely nothing. A clear-cut opening will mean something, but squares on a map don't. And so a key goal of our conservation easements is to conserve and then restore on ongoing management the little white patches, which are the privately owned lands there. And this is right outside of Dunsmuir, Castle Crags area, and that's I-5 running through the side of the slide. Next slide, please. So our working forest conservation easements with private landowners are a really adaptable, flexible tool that we apply. And I wanted to share two examples with you. One is at a more family level on 3,600 acres, relatively high on the shoulder of Mount Shasta. You can see from the picture on the right, part of Butte Creek Meadows. That's 600 acres of really critical wet alpine meadows. It's a source of Butte Creek, which flows eventually into the Klamath River. But this is an area where when wolves first returned to California, this is where they came. It has cascade frog, snowshoe hare, which is a highly endangered species because it can only go so high, silver-haired bat, and many, many others. On the left, you can see how we approach conservation easements, and that is that we establish different kinds of management zones across the area covered by that conservation easement in order to best protect and focus management for those habitat characteristics. So within this 3,600, you'll see a big chunk for the wet meadow area. There's also some much older forest, which has special management terms associated with it. And then there's matrix lands and more. I want to flag that these are very adaptable tools so that you can target your restrictions to what you want to achieve on the landscape. Now, in this particular easement, they do run cattle in the summer, and it's part of a traditional pattern that's been practiced actually in many areas of the world, which is that in the winter, cattle are in the lowlands, and in the summer, they're in the higher wet meadows. And this is done compatibly with sandhill cranes as well as these wolves. So a really remarkable family and a remarkable landscape. That's a very tailored approach there. And I'd like to share another example where this is in a more financially managed landscape. Next slide, please. And this is a 13,000 acre conservation easement with an industrial owner known as a Timber Investment Management Organization. So their primary goal here is less about legacy, and it's more about managing this land for financial return, as well as creating a legacy that others will benefit from. And within this, there is not cattle grazing, but it is for timber production. So you can see here, more of the land is in this matrix color, that kind of lighter green. And I want to flag that there are restrictions within the matrix that are really focused not just on these special habitats, which are the different colors, but within the matrix, management is designed to allow and foster and encourage and create older, more natural stand conditions. So greater diversity of species, much larger trees with minimums of 30 inches and above. And so that you get both the matrix and these special habitat zones of springs and meadows and so on. 127 species are supported here, of which 17 are special status. And it's really quite diverse with 14 different habitat types on it. This feeds into Squaw Creek, which then feeds in turn into the McLeod. These easements are designed with performance goal about what management is to achieve over time, and they require a management plan which is updated every 10 years to reflect the changing conditions on the properties. Next slide, please. So one of the key things about conservation easements is that they're designed to last forever. And as we know, our climate is changing, and therefore what kind of habitat is provided on the landscape is changing. And one of the challenges for all of us in this field is, what is the value of this conservation over time for biodiversity? One of the key reasons that we work in this particular area is that it is projected to be refugia for more species in California than any other area. So we, with funding from the Wildlife Conservation Board, developed a model to analyze what this changing condition looks like on the landscape, working with the global change models. Worked with UC Davis and Duke University on that. So what you see here is a set of static maps that show how this region changes over time. This is on a particular project. It's an 11,000 acre project in the Trinity headwaters. Next slide, please. And what this shows is that by 2100, this region will be pretty darn stable. So that means that the habitat services that it provides today will be the habitat services that it provides tomorrow, but it is also welcoming in a suite of species that are moving upwards from lower elevations into higher elevations where it will be cooler and where there's more water available. And one of the things that I wanted to flag with this is that by having a permanent conservation easement on these lands, we can ensure that management and restoration continues to provide that welcome mat well into the future. Next slide. So this is just a pretty slide to give you an indication of some of the species that are there, the Townsend's bat, willow flycatcher, and the cascade frog. With that. And we were very grateful to the Sierra Nevada Conservancy for making a grant to this at the same meeting that Kay just mentioned recently. Next slide, please. This is just a little wake-up call about what 2100 is supposed to look like in this overall region. You can see that the lower elevations get extremely hot. And that means that it's going to be very difficult to maintain the current habitat functions there at the broader scale in those areas. So that's a big motivator for us to really scale up conservation through this 30 by 30 pathway effort, and just how important it is to conserve more on the landscape so that our amazing biodiversity has a place to move to and a place to live. Last slide, please. And with that, I'd like to say thank you, because people benefit enormously from this, whether it is by providing them the long-term place in which to do resource management, or for us to all benefit from the water and other biodiversity services that this land provides. Thank you.
Lori, that was amazing. That was so great. Thank you. I have a million questions, but I'm going to let Erin tell us her story, and then we will bring all three of you back, and we're going to have a conversation. But I thank you so much for really showing us the range of things in the forest landscape that meet our definition. And I love that you're excited to scale up. We'll put you to that. So now we're going to turn to Erin Praler. She's the Coastal Program Manager for the California Coastal Commission's statewide planning unit. And she works on emerging issues, including sea level rise, coastal access, nature-based adaptation strategies, wildfire resilience, affordable housing, and public trust resources. Erin also oversees the Commission's open space and conservation easement program, which she's going to tell us a little bit about today, securing permanent protection of open space land, sensitive habitat, agricultural resources, and scenic view sheds in the coastal zone. And I will share with you that, we asked people a lot of questions, asked people what are the questions on your mind, and all of you are just answering them naturally. But one of them is, what does it look like in the coastal zone to be thinking about easements? So Erin, take it away. Thanks for being here. Look forward to hearing what you have to say.
Great.
Beautiful slide.
Thank you. And we can move to the next slide, please. So I thought today I'd briefly introduce the California Coastal Commission, but before I jump into some examples of how our work with open space and conservation easements supports 30 by 30. So the California Coastal Commission is a state agency that plans and regulates the use of land and water in California's coastal zone. The Coastal Act is the land use planning law we implement that applies a specific set of land use planning principles and resource protection provisions to planning and development. Now, the boundaries of the coastal zone were defined by the legislature, and this geographic region encompasses both land and water areas along the length of the California coastline from the Oregon border to the Mexico border. The land portion of the coastal zone is shown in red on the screen. And as you can see, compared to the rest of the state, the coastal zone is a really narrow band along the coast, but it represents approximately 1.5 million acres of land that includes significant coastal resources, major population centers, and really popular recreational and tourist destinations. There are 76 local governments, both cities and counties, that have all or a portion of their jurisdiction within the coastal zone. And so the California Coastal Commission works very closely with these local governments to ensure implementation of the Coastal Act. Next slide, please. Chapter 3 of the Coastal Act provides criteria for evaluating new development projects, with specific policies addressing a really broad range of issue areas: shoreline public access and recreation, lower cost visitor serving uses, terrestrial and marine habitat protection, scenic resources, agricultural lands, commercial fisheries, industrial uses, offshore oil and gas development, transportation, and more. Next slide, please. So the commission has 4 programs that contribute to 30 by 30, but I'm going to focus on some examples from our regulatory program, which is the primary way that the commission requires conservation easements. Coastal development permits are the heart of our regulatory program. And so in permit review, proposed developments within the coastal zone are brought into compliance with the policies of Chapter 3 of the Coastal Act. And that sometimes means that our commission requires conservation easements to protect certain resources. Next slide, please. Over the last 5 decades, the California Coastal Commission has protected approximately 12,000 acres within the coastal zone through open space and conservation easements. And in just the last 2 years, the Commission's program has secured conservation of over 800 acres. Most open space and conservation easements are required as mitigation for coastal development permits approved by the Commission, either as offers to dedicate, which are then accepted by a third party, or as grants of easements, where the easement is granted directly to a third party. The public resource benefits of these offers to dedicate are not fully realized until the offer is accepted by a managing entity that agrees to hold and maintain the easement in perpetuity. And so while our staff tries to find accepting entities as close in time to approval of a project with an easement requirement, we have a significant list of offers to dedicate easements that have not yet been accepted. And so a big part of our open space and conservation easement program involves tracking those outstanding easement offers and finding entities to accept them. To date, the Commission has partnered with over 70 different local and state government agencies and nonprofit entities, including land trusts and conservation organizations, to accept these easements. And we're always looking for new partners to add to that list. Next slide, please. So the Commission uses open space and conservation easements to protect environmentally sensitive habitat areas, wetlands, steep slopes, agricultural lands, archaeological and cultural resources, and public view sheds within the coastal zone. So these are 4 examples of past open space and conservation easements that the Commission has required. Environmentally sensitive habitat and wetlands at Zmiadowski State Beach, steep slopes and maritime chaparral along Encinal Road in Malibu, agricultural lands at Blome Ranch, and the scenic view sheds of the Big Sur coastline. Next slide, please. So most recently, in this past year, we got 4 separate offers to dedicate conservation easements accepted by the Watsonville Wetlands Watch program, which protects over 89 acres of agricultural land and wetlands in the Pajaro Valley in Santa Cruz County. And these agricultural and habitat conservation easements were required through a coastal development permit for construction of a new high school in the early 2000s. So as you can see on this slide, the surrounding area includes significant agricultural production. And so those agricultural easements here allow both continued ag production and habitat restoration work. The wetlands in this part of the Watsonville Slough system are protected through habitat conservation easements for their critical habitat and wildlife functions. Next slide, please. Another recent win for the Commission's program is this 162-acre site. In 2021, Los Angeles County accepted this offer to dedicate, and this area includes a lot of coastal sage scrub and chaparral habitat located north and inland of El Pescador, El Matador, and Lechuza beaches near Encinal Canyon in Malibu. The addition of this open space expands the area of public open space within the Santa Monica Mountains and provides more habitat and wildlife connectivity in this area. And this open space dedication was required as a condition of approval of a permit for a large residential subdivision project, and the Commission approved that in the early 1990s. In this case, the open space was primarily required to protect sensitive coastal habitats and scenic views, but trails for hiking and equestrian use are also allowed within the open space. So this is one example of the multiple benefits that many of our open space and conservation easements provide, not just for ecological function, but also often for scenic views and public access and recreation. Next slide, please. So I'm just going to close with a note about our public access program. The Coastal Act also prioritizes public access and recreational opportunities in the coastal zone. And although many of our open space and conservation easements allow for public access and recreation, like hiking trails, the Commission will typically require a separate public access easement for areas that are appropriate for more intense public access use and development. So, boardwalks and paved trails and parking lots and bathrooms. We'll often see projects, things like hotel developments or large residential subdivisions that include both a public access easement and an open space and conservation easement to help define appropriate use areas and protect more sensitive coastal resources. So we use different types of easements to complement one another. And I'll close it there.
Outstanding. Thank you so much, Erin. And thank you to all the panelists. I love the breadth of, and I think we can bring everybody back, Lori and Kay. I love the breadth of what we've shown, and yet there's still more. So I saw in the chat a question about hunting and fishing. Yes, there are many recreational spaces where hunting and fishing occurs, and those are held under conservation easement, also in public ownership. I want to encourage folks to take a look at the Pathways to 30 by 30 strategy. We spent a lot of time on the definition of sort of 30 by 30 conservation areas and tried so hard to make it clear all the ways that easements can count, but it's a big universe. And so we're showing a few here today, but page 25 of the document goes on for a little while, but it does sort of walk through all the different ways. And Erin, you brought up regulatory and easements, and that's a really important piece, not only the avoidance easements, but also those that are offsets and mitigation, right? So there's a lot of development that happens in California, and what makes California special is that when we lose habitat, we actually require that there be protected lands that offset those special places. So a lot of the protected areas in our state come from, you build a freeway, but then we protect some land somewhere else, and that reduces the net loss over time, which is not true throughout the state, the rest of the country and the world. So I have questions for all of you. We have about 15 minutes, so hopefully we can do a little digging. I'm actually going to start with you, Lori, because as I said, forests it's just a complex universe. And I think in particular, it's complicated because people see the obvious extraction and they have emotional reactions to that sometimes. And then we have this overlay of forest fire and just the potential for catastrophic loss. And so I'm interested to know from you, I have so many questions, but the first one, I guess, is sort of what's the sort of main misunderstanding people have about taking timber off the landscape, and how you sort of address that through your partnership?
Sure. Well, you may have noticed that we're the Pacific Forest Trust as opposed to the Pacific Timber Trust.
Okay. Good
And
point.
I think that one of the things that commonly happens is that we rely on the value of timber to pay for keeping the land. And when you want to align both public benefits and private interests, you look for that sweet spot. Where do these overlap? And forests contain trees, but just plantations of trees may not act as forests.
Right.
And so what we do with our conservation easements is look at how we can restore those or manage those areas with trees to have the full forest functions. Often what that translates to is a different spacing in the forest, having bigger and older trees as well as smaller, younger trees. But bigger, older trees take time. Time costs money. You remember that phrase, the time value of money. And that's the fabulous thing about conservation easements. They pay for the opportunity cost of changing management to both extend time and sometimes take less timber in the near term so that you rebuild more timber in the long term. So there's an enormous overlap about the tool of the conservation easement that pays for the opportunity cost of more natural forest management. Because growing, forests grow for thousands of years. Well, who can wait for a financial return in thousands of years? Very few private entities can do that. So what conservation easements do is pay you for that value. And it's, I noticed one of the questions in the chat or the Q&A was around that. And this is what wonderful organizations associated with your agency and complementary to your agency, like the Wildlife Conservation Board, like the Sierra Nevada Conservancy, Santa Monica's Conservancy, they provide the funding to help purchase those along with the tax benefits that landowners can get in donating portions of their landscapes. So I think the most common misunderstanding is, does timber harvesting necessarily destroy a forest? And the answer is no. Timber harvesting can be a really positive tool, really done right, to restore those forests and then maintain them over time. And that's where that sweet spot between kind of the public benefit and the private benefit can do coincide. I just want to say one thing about fires, if that's all right.
Yeah, please.
And that is that many people think fires destroy a forest, but actually fires are an integral part of the forest system. And even in a catastrophic fire, the impact on, for example, carbon release is that 2 to 8% of that forest carbon is released in a fire as compared to what happens in some very intensive harvests. And the tragedy that we face is in that interface between your wildlands and your built environments. And that so often we lose people as well as animals in those fires because of that. But I did just want to flag that many fires, in fact, most of them are not in forests, and that fire can be beneficial done right.
Thanks for reminding us of that. Appreciate it. So you made the point about economic value on the landscape. Kay, I want to turn to you because I think keeping ranching on the landscape is another economic benefit, but it's another place where I think there's maybe some misunderstanding about how that is used and how that works. Can you say a little bit more about how you're working with ranchers in the Eastern Sierra for conservation?
Certainly, and how it ties to the economic benefits. I have one small example of an easement that we did with the parents. So bought an easement and bought the development rights, I should say, and at fair market value. So the landowners received those funds. They invested in water conservation on the property. They added equipment, they added some land, they took some of the funds and opened a business in our small little town, which was a bookstore, and hired 4 people. So that's one tiny example of some economic benefits, even on a small scale. And in Mono County and Inyo County, agriculture, while tourism is the #1 driver here in our region, ag is something like $57 million of benefits into our regional economy. I think those were 2001 figures. So
Wow.
there's a lot of snowballs that can happen.
And, I have observed that a lot of really healthy landscapes are in private ownership and being grazed, right? So it's another misunderstanding that, grazing is, wholly negative for the landscape. Like that's a misconception. I think certainly there are cases where places have not been managed well, but on the whole, private landowners, that's their land. They want it to be functional through the long term. And so you're using it in sagebrush, sage grouse habitat, right?
Yes.
Say more about how you work with the landowner to sort of further the work that they're already doing. How does that come together?
It's amazing how these two things are symbiotic. And I will say, just to your first point, that there's old school land management, right? I mean, how we want to define that. And more, there's a new wave of holistic, sustainable ranchers and using those methods. And I will say that the science that we rely on shows that well-managed cattle lands where there's good rotation, good movement, works with the sage grouse. because they bring the little babies down, and when they're babies, they can't eat the sage. Their bodies can't digest and get the protein out of it. So when they're babies, the moms brings them down into the irrigated wetland where the cows are walking, pulling up or just moving some grasses around, pulling some bugs around, and the little chicks come down, eat it, and then fly back into the protection of the sage away. So those two things work well together. And I'll say too that one of the wonderful things with the majority of conservation easements is there is a management plan that's associated with it. So when you can get a good management plan on working lands, it's not just 1 and 1, you know, it's like 5 or 10 or 20.
That's great. Thank you for making that point. I'm going to turn to Erin. So another sort of challenge, I think, in these sort of mixed use lands is, you know, how do you find that balance? How do you figure out what that management plan needs to look like? And I'm thinking in particular about recreation. We get a lot of questions about how can recreation be compatible with biodiversity conservation? And of course we see it, but how do you put those pieces together? What's the process you use to really land on the management that makes the most sense?
Oh,
Tell us
that's
about your
such
day to
a
day.
great question. And it's a challenge that we grapple with all the time. And honestly, I would say COVID actually put that even more into sharp relief, right? When so much of our lives shut down and we did have access to outdoor spaces, we just saw so much more interest and use in our open spaces. So that really has brought to light some of those conflicts and the intensity of our public desire to be outside and using these amazing resources. You know, we look at these on a case-by-case basis, trying to understand who are the populations likely to use those areas and what is the best match. Part of that analysis includes looking at existing public access resources in the area and amenities. So we have a public access guide that details all the trails, all the, you know, park benches and bathrooms and parking lots to try to understand what's already in an area. If we're opening up an area where there historically has not been public access, you know, how can we facilitate that in a way that's going to be most protective of the surrounding habitat and wildlife that may be in the area? So it's, you know, a lot of analysis of, you know, what's already out there and how do we think humans are likely to use an area. Sometimes I think we do a really great job. Other times we wind up surprised by how popular a site becomes or some of the management issues that come up. And we've seen changes over time with, you know, new technology. Instagram means people are finding sites that previously were more locally known. And so it's really increasing the number of people using those. E-bikes on beaches is another example of like a new use that suddenly changes the way that people are using our spaces. So that's an incredible challenge that we are grappling with constantly. And I don't think we have a great solution.
And I think too, I think of this myself sometimes, you know, there is a degree of sort of, I hate to use the word sacrifice zone, but you recognize that there's places people are going to use with the hope that you will funnel them toward those places and protect some of the other places that are maybe out of sight. And so that leads to sort of this perception maybe by the user that, oh, this place is trashed, but it's really probably where we are. And then I think through smart planning, you can hopefully keep people toward the places where maybe really sensitive resources are sort of farther away and out of sight. That's at least I hope how you're doing it.
No, it is. And I mean, I think that's also that last slide that I shared, that sort of distinction between using public access easements compared to conservation easements, that in some ways that's meant to, you know, really define those areas that are better for more intense public access use. And that, you know, we will implement things like, you know, fencing and signage and all of that to try to make sure that we're preserving as much of the sensitive resources that do fall within a public access easement. But we try to, you know, tailor those easements based on how we expect an area to be used.
Very cool. Thank you. Lori, I'm thinking too about your process. You sort of alluded to this in your presentation, but it looks like you use a lot of science and information and forecasting to think about what you want the landscape to look like. Say a little bit more about your process of coming together to develop an easement with a landowner. I'm just sort of interested in how you get from the beginning to the end. Knowing it probably takes 10 years, but I wanted you to tell me in 3 minutes.
Well, thankfully, it doesn't generally take 10 years, although like Kay, we will sometimes have a landowner that gets in touch with us and then stops and then comes back in 10 years. So one of the wonderful things about land trusts is that there are 2 organizations in this country that were designed legally to last forever, and that's land trusts and cemetery societies. So we take our obligations seriously. We want to honor those commitments in both cases. So how we approach a conservation easement is when we're looking at a property, either because the landowner came to us or because we've identified it through our own analysis, we're going to look at it for those conservation values. What are the species that live there? The biodiversity is a very front and center element there. And we use, of course, the CNDB. We use the State Wildlife Action Plan. There are a lot of state resources and federal resources about what species are there or should be there because of what the habitat types are. We do use that forecasting modeling approach that I was showing there to say, how is this going to be changing to the best of our knowledge over time, over this next 100-year period? And where are there little microsites within a very changing landscape? Because you can have something, a south-facing slope is going to be super hot, but the north-facing slope that has the same characteristics may remain cool and therefore have those characteristics over time. So first we walk through those. What are the water resources, the habitat resources, the species present? What's the condition of the forest? What are the condition of the wet and dry meadows? And we talk with the landowners about what they do, what they want to achieve. The financial objectives are obviously front and center for many financially oriented owners, and that is a major ownership class for forest lands. And then we put together a suite of restrictions that are also meeting the objectives of the state funding agencies. So obviously with the Wildlife Conservation Board, they've got clear goals around the habitat and the species protection that are there and the restoration. So it's a real dialogue process between the landowners and where they're coming from, what their needs and goals are, and what we want to achieve for the conservation of the public benefits. And sometimes those come together really quickly. But we also use, where we can, the landowner's own knowledge. They're often deeply knowledgeable about their properties, particularly those families that have been there for 150 to 200 years. And where we can, we'll consult with traditional ecological knowledge sources and practitioners, knowing how they have approached these lands as well. So it is a big deep dive. It's captured in a baseline documentation of the property. And then it's also captured in how we want to manage that land going forward in the performance goals, because we all recognize things are going to change. There are just a very few kind of clear restrictions. And those are targeted around the rate of removal and the amount of removal of timber in any given decade, and things like opening sizes. And then we, of course, allow for catastrophe. But that even after catastrophe, we want to go back to what the performance goal is, which is really the description of, what are the suite of species to be supported there and the structures. If you think of the trees and the shrubs and the grasses as the structures that are the building blocks of that mixed use community that is the forest.
Thank you. That was great. And I think that process, in my experience, Kay, I saw Kay nodding. I mean, that's reflective of how a lot of these easements come together. It's this dialogue between, what you want to accomplish. Sometimes it's public funding. Sometimes it's this mitigation, right? Where there's a regulatory agency that has something they're looking for. So I think that's important for people to take away, is that this is why easements are challenging to categorize, right? Because each one is unique. It has its own characteristics that are specific to that landscape and that relationship. But a broad suite of them help us achieve our 30 by 30 goals. Kay, I want to turn back to you for a minute and ask about this great land back experience you had, and have you tell us, what is advice you might have for others that are embarking on that journey. I think a lot of land trusts are excited about this promise, and I'd be interested to know, what advice you might have for those that want to pursue this.
Thank you. It's really exciting. And I'll say we haven't finished this project, and we all know there's a lot to do to get it finished, but we have a very dedicated and committed crew. I will say the number one thing that got this project rolling was that I had heard through the grapevine that there were some negative associations with 30 by 30 from tribal friends. Yeah. So I called to have a conversation where I learned a lot. I learned a lot from that 2-hour conversation, and it deepened our relationship. And we were just going to let it sit. We were just going to let it sit for a little bit to resonate. And then 4 or 5 days later, I got a phone call from the Sierra Nevada Conservancy saying there was new funding becoming available. So it all was opportunistic and kind of not strategic in some ways, but I think the honest basic base of it was willingness to learn, being willing to be nimble. And in this project, ESLT is not receiving any funds for our work. We are putting it all in as in kind. Funds are going for tribal engagement and then for the acquisition and due diligence. So I think, we have to be creative. We have to be creative to be stepping into this new, or at least new for my land trust.
Thanks, Kay. It's really an inspiration. Oh, Lori, jump in.
Just very briefly, there's another way that conservation easements can be used, and a project that we did on about 4,000 acres on the Mendocino coast. We did the first easement with, at that point, 9 unrecognized bands of Native Americans. And by doing the easement, on the property, the land was able to be conveyed to the Intertribal Sinkyone Wilderness Council. And having that land base, they were then able to get federal recognition. So I think there can be additional ways that conservation easements could be helpful in this regard. Just wanted to mention that.
Thank you.
Yeah, that is the case in this example as well. This will be land that was stolen originally from white settlers, and it will be fee title for this tribe, and it'll be a part of helping get federal recognition.
Sean, I see you jumping on, but I have one more question for Erin. So just wait. So Erin, you mentioned in your presentation that you are always looking for people to take easements. Can you say more about that and how people on this call can make that marriage happen? How can we help you through 30 by 30 or anything else?
Yeah, absolutely. I think a lot of us are familiar with the fact that it can be difficult to find partners to accept easements and take on the management of those areas. So I think the best way to reach us is to reach out directly to the statewide planning unit at the California Coastal Commission. And our email address is statewideplanning@coastal.ca.gov. I can drop that in the chat in a second. But folks should just feel free to reach out to us. Let us know if they're operating within the coastal zone, and we can add you to our list and start some conversations.
Awesome. I feel so honored to get to talk to the three of you, and now Sean's going to come in and I don't know what he's going to say, but thank you all for your great stories. It meant a lot. It's really valuable. Hi, Sean.
Hi, Jen. What a great panel. Thank you all so much. Jen, you did a masterful job moderating it, but Lori and Erin and Kay, your stories, the content, the preparation you put in was exactly what we wanted today, to showcase your work, but to also demonstrate how you serve as these vehicles for change making. You're all demonstrating the trust, the credibility, the hard work that goes into building spaces to bring people together to find that nexus of public benefit and private interest in ways that are really accelerating the work. So thank you so much, and for joining us today. Thanks too for everyone online who's joined and engaged in the Q&A and in the chat, really bringing forward thoughtful comments and questions, really hard questions too about how do we do this work in a way that really is communicated clearly and transparently, that honors the work and contribution of all the different communities across the state, and it helps us build the connections and the knowledge that carries the work forward. So thank you all. Do you want to transition next to the next conversation today? And really excited to bring Amanda Kohanek forward. Amanda's with Green Info Network, where she's currently the Senior Project Manager and Geospatial Data Analyst. She leads a variety of project teams with a focus on data collection and analysis. Our personal specialties include organization of complex projects and data, identification of systems for automation and demographic analyses. And frequently her projects involve not just those analyses, but also equity issues, equity and access to parks and open spaces, and reducing youth exposure to tobacco products and advertising. So Amanda, delighted to have you join us, and really excited to share how the tools and resources and approaches that you're involved with can contribute to our work as well. So I'll turn it over to you.
Wonderful. I have my screen up. I'll assume that's all good. I'm super excited to be here, and I love that I got to start by listening to all these wonderful examples and more specific cases of where folks are protecting land across California. As we saw, there's a huge diversity. And what I'll be focusing on today is how we keep track of all of that. How do we know what's on the land and what qualifies out there? So that's what we'll walk through today. So to start off, I wanted to just do a quick refresher for those who aren't intimately familiar with 30 by 30, a refresher on what counts. So what properties do get counted in 30 by 30? There are two main things we'll talk about today. I'll start with a high level and then dig into each of them a bit more. The first one is that the land must be protected. That could be through a deed or an easement. So fee title ownership of the property or an easement. Another key element is that we need to know it's there. So it needs to be within CPAD or CCED, which are the two databases I'll be talking about today. So in addition to this durable protection, we also need that it is protected for biodiversity. That is the priority of the land. There are a couple of ways that that comes out, but we'll be talking about the USGS gap code system, which is what's used by 30 by 30. It essentially comes down to those properties that are fee or easement, and gap code 1 or 2 will qualify in 30 by 30. And that talks about biodiversity and natural land cover on those lands. I did see in the chat earlier a couple of questions. Jen had put some high level numbers, and I'll try to give you a bit more detail on those numbers where we're at now. So California covers about 100 million acres. 24 million, a little bit more, are considered covered or conserved under 30 by 30 at this point. So that puts us at 24% with about 6 million to go. So those are a little bit rounded off, but for today's purposes, we'll go with those. And then I also wanted to call it out that today's conversation and CPAD and CCED and the data effort that we're working on is related to the terrestrial and lands numbers, not the coastal waters. Those are a separate measure that are made. So where do easements fit in, since that's our focus of today? Well, my sort of back of the envelope numbers show that of that 24%, about 4% come from easements. So those protected in private lands, much like the examples we were seeing from folks today. There are a little bit of nuances. Oftentimes the land could be protected in both fee title and then have an additional easement on top of that. So those numbers aren't specifically straightforward at all points. We do also know there are some data issues that I'm going to talk about today. We've been working on improving those. Jen noted that we've made some of those improvements, but we aim to continue to improve those. California is extremely large and very diverse. So we try to keep track of all of it, but it definitely takes an ongoing effort and a community of folks giving us information to make that happen. And then we also need to make sure that these gap code assignments that are one of the criteria in 30 by 30 are being properly appropriately assign to those lands once we know they're protected. So my working estimate is that the improvements in the data would add 2 to 3% to our 24. So as Jen showed, we started to get part of that percentage that was data improvements, as well as new lands coming on that we've even heard about today. So it's a bit of a moving target, but that's sort of the scope of where I think we're at. So I want to talk about quickly the two databases that feed into 30 by 30. There are other elements, but the key parts that come down to if the land is protected or not come from CPAD, which is the California Protected Areas Database, which has been around for a few decades now and has multiple uses before and beyond 30 by 30, but 30 by 30 is a wonderful use of it. We also have the California Conservation Easement Database. So that would be more oriented to the lands we were talking about today, where easements are present on the land. These are open public data sets, which we welcome and encourage you to contribute information back to us to improve them. It's worth noting that just because a property is in either or both database, it does not automatically qualify it for 30 by 30. We'll go through a little bit more of the biodiversity element that's needed with USGS GAP. And I'm happy to share the slide deck so folks have these links after, but you can always learn more about these databases online. So California is thought to have one of the best inventories of public and private protected lands in the nation. We contribute to PAD US, the Protected Areas Database of the US. But there's always room for improvement. We are tracking information for over 1,000 agencies and nonprofits. That's a lot of folks to be keeping track of. And each of those agencies and organizations are unique, unique in the way they function, unique in their technical capacity, unique in the types of lands they're trying to protect on the landscape. So there's a lot of variables happening out there, as we already saw just in the 3 examples given today. Given the focus of easements today, I did want to call out that easements have been traditionally harder to track in these systems. So knowing that they're out on the land, the conditions that exist or do not exist in them, the durability of that protection, whether they be permanent or for time series, and also some issues of privacy in the past have been issues. So easements are known to be a little less accurate in terms of the accounting that we have in our database. We are actively working on that, but really encourage folks that own, manage, and work on those lands to reach out to us. We consider you the authoritative source of that information. So if we can get that from you directly, that's always our best avenue. Talking about biodiversity. So in order to, if you have your lands included in CPAD, CCED, those feel accurate. The next thing is that you need to make sure the gap code assignment is correct. This is covered more and more materials outside of this, but I'll do a broad overview today, which is that this is coming out of the USGS system gap codes. So it is a national standard that is being used. And what we're looking at is the durability of protecting biodiversity on that property. It's worth noting this could be an instance where the biodiversity may not currently in this exact moment be present, as in you may have purchased a property and have an active management plan and funding and are restoring it to that. So there are nuances within all of these elements. The main thing I did want to talk about today also is this note that we know the information within CPAD and CCED. So each piece of property within those 2 geospatial databases has a gap code slot. It may or may not have data within there. And so what we're really working on between now and December, which is the next time this will come out for a 30 by 30 update, is to make sure that we get those gap codes right. And so in order of transparency, we want to make sure that we know that those first assignments of gap codes really focused on federal efforts. So those came out of PAD US, the US Protected Areas Database. And the reason for that was that they could use ownership, the name, and a combination of designations such as wild and scenic rivers on the property to do large bulk assignments of the acreage across California. The problem with this is that we know it doesn't roll down to the state and the local level. So that's where we're really focusing our efforts on trying to get your input to make those scores better. So values are in there. In most federal cases, we feel they're quite good. We've had a fair amount of state outreach, but we're really focusing on the regional and local input now and looking for your help on that. And with that said, gap code assignment can be challenging. I won't be able to go over that in the 10 minutes today. But I did want to say that we are here to help try to facilitate questions and find answers in the community that make sense. So that can look like bringing groups together that have similar type plans to make sure that they're on the same page on how they're classified, organizing working groups. We've worked a lot with K and CCLT to organize a few and looking to do more webinars. So please reach out if you think there are things we can help with. A few really common questions we've had are listed here for you. You don't need to tell us where within your property. So if you have 100 acres and you say 50% are gap 2 and 50% are gap 3, don't need to spatially define where those are. We just need the acreage counts for those. They can be estimates by percent, or you can put in actual numbers. So we're trying to be quite flexible in how. So if you know there are 100 acres, or you know it's 10%, or whatever the most functional way for you to report that information to us, either is acceptable. And your properties can have a mix of gap codes. You often have large properties, and they will have a mix of gap codes. So that can be reflected in the numbers. And yes, you do have the ability to submit gap codes for your own properties that you manage and or own. So those can be submitted from you and will come into our system. So how to do that? We have a couple different ways. So as I said, if you own or manage lands, then you are the person we were hoping to get that contribution from. If you already have existing information about your properties, we're not asking that you recreate that in some specific format. We are willing to accept data you may already have. So if you have GIS, we're happy to accept those type of files. Maybe you have reports or maps or just a list of your parcel numbers. Any of the type of information can help us get you into CPAD and CCED and work with you to make sure that's accurate. If you want to see what we already have for your agency within CPAD and CCED, or you would like to use our toolkit, which is our sort of standard out of the box way to review and return information, we have what are called toolkits. And I'll just give you a really quick preview of that. So when you go to our website online under CPAD and CCED, we have a whole section dedicated to the 30 by 30 effort. You can download your gap toolkit, and you know these are specific to the agency that manages the property. So you're downloading a subset of the data. You can download the whole state from the main page if you want, but this allows you just to focus in on your properties. So you just enter some or all keywords to your agency and download that zip file. Once it's downloaded, you'll notice a number of files. We're trying to accommodate, like I said, a number 1,000+ agencies that have different capacities. So one way you're able to review the data, if it works for you, is through GIS. We have shapefiles that you can use. You can pull those up in your software of choice. You can use that simply to view the information and then submit back to us comments or other files, or you can work directly in those files and edit and send them back. We have narrowed this down to the very core key elements that are critical to 30 by 30 and getting you into the database. So these are the things that we're hoping you can review, such as naming the property, is the public allowed to access the property, and the gap code status. If you are not a GIS person, that's totally fine. We also offer Excel table downloads that you can look through, and those offer ability to launch off onto web maps where you can view the property just in a web browser. Again, you can submit feedback and information to us in this table or other formats that work for you. And then, like I said, we're trying to be flexible. If there are other things you need to help accommodate you reviewing or including your lands in either databases, we're happy to do that. We can send KML, KMZ files. We also have standard maps where we can map any individual property across the state that you need and send you a PDF map. So all of these are ways that we're willing to work with you. My email will be at the end. I'll make sure it's in the chat. We welcome one-on-one support. So do feel free if you have confusion or questions about these different options, just drop us a note and we're happy to either email or get on a call with you to help you understand your options. The last thing I wanted to touch on was the other effective area conservation measures that were previously brought up, but just the fact that because CPAD and CCED are larger than the 30 by 30 effort, we do cover those other examples that Jen had noted that may not count within one particular pathway, but essentially any of the lands that are protected, whether it be for recreational purpose, biodiversity purpose, any of those we're looking to track. So we're happy to get you you included, even if it's not under the GAP 1 or 2 method. If you fit through a different pathway or an OECM, that would be included through CPAD and CCED. And that's just the language, which includes some helpful examples of what those might look like down here at the bottom. So other efforts that use CPAD and CCED, if you put your information in for 30 by 30, it's wonderful. You'll also see it reflected in other efforts. So California State Parks, their grant system makes use of CPAD and CCED. So by contributing to one, it's reflected in the other. So we're trying to make an open data set that minimizes the amount of time you need to review and send us feedback about your properties. But this will be available for folks who want to look at these other examples. So the timeline, we're going to release new data by the end of the month. And then the data that will go into the next 30 by 30, we need to have out by December. So if you can get in touch with me between now and October, we can try to get your lands reflected the best way possible. And with that, I'll turn it back to you.
Thank you so much. I'm such a map nerd and a data nerd that I love that we're working together to really improve the information we have. So many questions in the chat that we can't get to because we've had such good conversations so far, but I want to really emphasize the sort of key takeaway from Amanda's presentation, which is that this is how we count to 30%. So some people have asked the question, like, if you get in the database, do you count? This is how we count. So we aren't going to go out to your land and say, oh, yes, you count. Now send your stuff to the database. Please send your information to us. And that's how we get to 30% together. And just to remind you what Amanda said, that we generally consider GAP 1 and GAP 2 as meeting our definition. If you are looking at your land and you say, I think I'm GAP 2, why am I not in? It's probably because you're misclassified, and we need you to come to us and fix that. I think there's a default to 4 if we don't know what's happening on that landscape, but it's in public ownership or under an easement. So really want to emphasize the value of really recognizing all the good work we already have done together. And I guess I would just say, maybe a simple way to think through all these different ways of classifying is sort of the reasonable person's test. Is this property going to be protecting biodiversity over the long run, or can it turn into a parking lot? If the former, it's probably going to meet our definition to some degree. So work with Green Info Network, get in our system, help us count to 30. It's really important. And with that, I think do I need to turn it back over to you, Sean? Or do we have time for just a couple questions?
Yeah, we probably have time for a question or two for Amanda, if you'd like to bring anything forward. And just to reemphasize what you said, Jen, that this is really a chance just to bring this forward today to make sure that people understand that there is this opportunity to connect directly with Amanda and the team at Green Info Network to ask their questions, to seek clarification. And even a lot of the questions that are coming forward in the chat, what we'll do is we'll capture those and share this back with the community, because so much of the knowledge, the responses that are needed to answer those questions reside not just within CNRA, but across the broader community of practice here. And so we'll make sure to capture all those great questions that are coming in.
Yeah,
Jen,
and I would just remind folks again that our definition in our pathways document, it's like 4 or 5 pages long, and we define the gap codes, we describe what those are. We try to unpack easements, which again, those are complicated and what we're trying to talk about today. But Green Info Network really has the tools to operationalize that and help us really capture it in a concrete way. So we appreciate that very much. I am terrible at looking through the Q&A while I'm listening to a presentation. So maybe
I'll say one thing while you,
yeah,
or if you, one thing I will say is please don't be shy. You do not need to work in tech or any way to work with me. I am happy to accommodate you where you're at. So if you just know your properties, that's the information I don't know, and I can apply the tech to get them into the databases. So please do reach out. Just the presentations this morning were such a reminder of how incredibly diverse the agencies and the lands are that are being protected, and they're all very critical. So please call me when you need help. I'm happy to be there.
Yeah, thanks so much, Amanda. And we did provide quite a few links in the chat. We'll make sure that those are saved and distributed as well. Just a question from Volker that just came in, which is an interesting one. We did focus much on the land environment today. Are you at Green Info Network also able to help with questions around the marine environment and marine protected areas, or is that another conversation?
We've been less involved. There's obviously the meeting of the land and the water. So yeah, that's probably a pretty big topic to cover in the last few minutes, but happy to be engaged into the future on that.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
I would say because the coastal zone off the shore is more of a common trust resource. There's not sort of these differentiations of ownership, but there's differentiation of management. And it's really, broadly speaking, for the marine environment, it's important to recognize, and everyone should know, that the Ocean Protection Council is leading. So we are putting on these webinars sort of broadly about 30 by 30, and maybe we need to spend a dedicated time really talking about the coastal zone. But OPC is leading targeted conversations around the different ways that conservation will take place in the coastal waters and how we will recognize those, whether they're national marine sanctuaries, marine protected areas, or other effective measures that protect biodiversity. And so it's difficult to do the coastal waters and the lands because there's just different tools and different rules, but OPC is the home for that. And they actually have a website for 30 by 30 that shows you the different conversations that are happening. So if you're interested in that space, please do check out the Ocean Protection Council's website to stay up to date.
Great, Jen, that's a great resource. So want to just move towards closing here and thank again our panelists, and thank Amanda at Green Info Network and her colleague Dan, who is in the background with some resources and links, for joining us today, sharing their stories, sharing their insights, sharing guidance for the road ahead, providing us with tools and resources and tips for how we can continue to work together to accelerate the pace and scale of 30 by 30 moving forward. Jen, just offer any last words or comments from you before we say goodbye for the day.
Well, I have a couple of key announcements that I didn't make at the beginning because I was so excited to hear from our panelists. So folks should know that we have a bunch of different funding sources that have been released or are in the process of being released. So there's funding for the Natural Community Conservation Program that the Department of Fish and Wildlife just released. There's another for transportation, biodiversity protection in the transportation area. I can't remember what that's called, but somebody will put that in the chat for me. And then lastly, we've been working really hard on our tribal nature-based solutions fund and program. We've been taking comment from tribes, having tribal consultation. Those guidelines are going to go out for one more round of review. So keep your eye out. We'll make sure to share that widely. We've made some changes based on conversations and want to make sure that folks see those changes and get feedback. So be aware of that. Also, just if you aren't already on our mailing list, please get on it. We do put out a newsletter about 6 times a year now and get a lot of good information from that and a lot of inspiration. And then finally, letting you know that June 21st, we're going to have the secretary is going to host a speaker series on 30 by 30. It's intended for the broader audience beyond our partnership, hopefully getting more people into the movement. So keep an eye out for that June 21st. And with that, I love these conversations. They always energize me. They're so much fun. Thank you, Sean, for helping us get through it. We're right at time.
Yeah, what a wonderful discussion. Thank you all. Thank you all for joining. Thank you all for the work you do every day to advance work in your neck of the woods and your corner of California. Thanks, Jen, and everyone who helped bring inspiration and content to us today. Enjoy the rest of your week and stay tuned.
Thanks, everyone.